The United States had the privilege to count with the promotion of writers of deep political conscience. I'm talking of Edmund Wilson, Susan Sontag, Lionel Trilling, John Didion, Miller, Baldwin, Mailer, Hellman. You are among them the more contentious. It's my opinion. You come from a very affluent family. Your grandfather was a senator. Your stepfather was a prominent and rich lawyer. You have been in contact with the elite, the Roosevelts, the Astors, the Rockefellers. How that transition between the golden cradle and social criticism operate?
Well, to begin with, my family was not affluent. You'll see my grandfather, the senator who founded the state of Oklahoma, and 30 years its senator, and I was brought up in his house. He died poor, the only senator from Oklahoma, an oil state, who had no money because he took no graft. So we were an uncorrupt family. The affluence of my stepfather, Mr. Auchincloss, has nothing to do with me. He's no relative of mine, except he happened to be my mother's husband, and the father of two of his children. So I was outside all that. I have supported myself since I was 17 years old when I enlisted in the Army of the United States in 1943 in the Second World War, where I served for 3 years. I got out of the Army having spent, because of my leg, quite a time in hospital. And in hospital, I wrote my first novel. By the time I got out, I gave it to a publisher and they published it. So I have paid for myself all my life.
Then how did you become aware of the problems inherent to the United States, to have a political conscience? Since when? How it started?
Oh, I think it starts with my grandfather. He was blind from the age of 10, and he went out to Indian Territory. He was a lawyer, although blind, and I read to him. I was taught to read about 8 or 9 by my grandmother, who was very sly. She was tired of reading to him because he was read to all day long in the Senate by his secretary. He had a couple of male secretaries that read to him. Then he got home and Mrs. Gore, my grandmother, was expected to read to him. She finally had a grandchild who loved reading, and the senator liked to hear me read. So at 10, 11, 12, I was reading the Congressional Record. I was the only 12-year-old who understood bimetallism, which was a great thing in the Finance Committee when he was chairman. So I was brought up in the heart of the Senate. And of course, by the time I was adolescent, I understood what the Senate was all about, and I understood the debates. And some of them, I remember 1936, when he introduced, at the behest of President Roosevelt, Social Security, which was the only measure ever done by an American president and Congress to help old people when they got old, needed medical care. The Republicans, the rich people who never want the poor to get anything, their propaganda was, if Social Security passes, you will lose your name and you will only have a number. Oh, they were frightened. John Smith would just be a number, an administrative number in a new kind of, Orwell didn't exist then, but if Orwell did, it was an Orwellian world. They believed was out there. The lies which our poor people have been exposed to in my lifetime are just beyond anything that you think reasonable people could accept. But they did. And that is when I think I became instinctively a correctionist. You know, when Confucius, who was essentially a teacher, and he was not religious at all, but one of his students said, you know, Master Kung, what would you do if the mandate of heaven should come to you, meaning if you become emperor of China? which was then in lots of pieces. And Confucius said, the first thing I would do is rectify the language. Because if the people do not understand the emperor, there is no communication, there is no society, there is nothing. It is all language. And that is what he wanted to do. Well, I'm not that ambitious. There were those who thought the Kennedy family were communists because they wanted to extend democracy to all Americans, particularly the hated ones in some areas, like African Americans. Many white Americans were very, very happy to keep them down. Kennedy was a reasonable liberal man who wanted to free everybody. He was called a communist. They didn't know what communism was. No idea, just as a bad word. And they could smear him with it. So we heard, when things make no sense, that is when writers must start writing and speaking.
Good. What made you start your historical novels cycle? All the historical novels. When did you start thinking about that?
Well, I never sat down and devised a plan. I did a sort of autobiographical, the only autobiographical novel I ever wrote was called Washington, D.C. And it was a good bit about my childhood and my family. And the world of power as seen from a senatorial family, right in the middle of everything as we were. And I thought, writing it, how wrong everybody else was getting it. I mean, already, we have instant history all the time, and instant propaganda even more. And I saw, really, we need a lot of correction here. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt did know that the Japanese were going to attack at Pearl Harbor, and he wanted them to attack because that would be an excuse for him to get the American people, 80% of whom did not want to go to war in Europe against Hitler. He thought if they hit us, their war machine hit our fleet at Pearl Harbor, we would go to war. The people would be united certainly against Japan. And it came to pass. He was a great Machiavellian. He was also our greatest president. So you have to buy Machiavelli in order to get a great president. But I think most people who know history know that's the case.
You said that Abraham Lincoln was the first of the modern tyrants, and that he preserved the American Union by destroying it. You also said that Lincoln secretly desired his tragic disappearance as a way to erase his sense of guilt due to his bloody way of refounding the nation in a very despotic manner. You are a descendant also of Southern families that lost their patrimony in the Secession War, if I'm correct.
You are correct.
What was the main strategic consequence of that conflict in present day?
Well, it's our Trojan War. This is the only thing that defines the United States. And Lincoln is a sort of combination of Homer, because I think of him more as a great poet than I do as a great statesman. And he's our Pericles as well. Lincoln had a great ear for poetry, which it resonates in his prose, in his addresses, his letters. But he didn't care much on the issue of slavery. He was not an abolitionist. He didn't fight the war to free African Americans. He thought that the United States was a bit too small to start splitting it up into two countries. And he gave the South all sorts of opportunities to avoid civil war. And the South was just bloody-minded, and the South paid no attention. And finally, in his first inaugural address, he's been elected president. They've said if he's elected, Virginia will go, South Carolina will go, and the Union will start to disappear. He was elected president, and the Union started to disappear. When he made his first address outside of the Capitol, and he said, on the subject of civil war, my fellow countrymen, it will be your choice, not mine. We have given every everything we could to accommodate you. And if you resist, then remember that I, not you, have an oath in heaven. And this is the presidential oath of office: to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So on your heads, my fellow countrymen, should war come, it is yours. And that was our great Augustus.
Mark Twain said that the Stars and Stripes flag should be substituted with a new banner with skull and bones. You have said that Theodore Roosevelt was the initial bully that started the ballroom brawl in American politics. In what way Dick Cheney, Condoleezza, Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, Karl Rove, Wolfowitz represent the oil industry interests and are the present bullies of the political cabaret?
Well, they are interested only in money, power, for power's sake. And this is not understood in Europe very well, and not in the United States really either, that after 9/11, they used this catastrophe for a coup d'etat. This is a well thought out coup d'etat. They already had contingency plans ready in case of terrorism, violence, whatever, which they had inherited from Clinton, who had put together some terrible legislation after Timothy McVeigh blew up the building in Oklahoma City. So it was ready-made for them to call an emergency and pretend it was wartime. Now this, if we had a functioning government, which we did not then, and we don't have really much of one anymore, of any kind, there it was very clear that a bunch of religious zealots had struck the United States. Instead, this crazy little president starts to go around saying, I'm a wartime president, I'm a wartime president, I'm a wartime president. Nobody has said you're not. There's no war. You can't have a war without a country, without an enemy. You can't say 14 terrorists from Saudi Arabia constitutes a war. Or if there is, you might make war on Saudi Arabia, but they didn't have anything to do with it. And we knew that, and also their beloved allies of the Bush family. They used under the mask of pretending this is war, and the war on terrorism is a metaphor, and terrorism is an abstract noun. It's like a war on dandruff. There's no such thing, It isn't war, it's just a slogan. But using the slogan, they got through the USA Patriot Act, which removes many of our liberties, the so-called Bill of Rights. It's been much, eliminated by that. And the other day, it was just a few weeks ago, I watched the end of the American Republic, and it was astonishing. Our media is totally corrupt and totally hopeless. Nobody made a sound when we lost habeas corpus. Now, most newspapers would say the average American doesn't know what habeas corpus is. Ha, ha, ha. Well, the last laugh is going to be against them. Without habeas corpus, which we've had since Magna Carta for 700 years, that was our great gift from England, our going away present when we separated from the mother country. And we had that, Magna Carta. Every man's home is his castle. And above all was the great rubric of the United States: all sovereignty rests in we, the people in Congress assembled. All power resides there, nowhere else. And what we have finally is due process of law. That's what habeas corpus is all about. Bring the body on view, free. Bring into court, and he will be judged by his peers, 12 members, a jury, And that has been the American Anglo-Saxon way. That is the good part of the two countries. And suddenly Bush managed to get rid of it. We've got an Attorney General, little Mr. Gonzalez, who seems to think he's Attorney General of Mexico. And he keeps coming up with more and more crazy plans about how the president has inherent powers as commander-in-chief. The president only has enumerated powers, which are enumerated in the Constitution, and it takes 4 minutes to read them. So they're pretending, and we have no media that is responsible. Congress has been dead for quite some time now with its Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. And there are some useful people in the Senate, and they all seem to be running for president, which means they're hopeless because they have to be with the War Party, they have to approve of the war and our brave boys over there, even though our brave boys should be taken away and brought home. But they don't dare say that because the Republicans will say, you want to cut and run. I mean, you see this little fool, he's out there shouting slogans. And one almost longs for the clarity of Hitler. But we're stuck with what we've got.
But that gang also has an important connection with the oil industry. They
Well,
do
of
have
course.
that, yes.
They're all in oil. And that has been true from the beginning. And Iraq was something, a piece of property they wanted. So instead, if he was going to go after Osama bin Laden, you go to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where he had been living, as far as our information goes, and you would have arrested him and put him on trial at The Hague for having bombed New York and Washington, D.C. That's the way to handle it. But these people wanted power, and they wanted to get their hands on the throat of the state and strangle the republic, which is what they have done. Let's go on.
You said in one of your writings that the United States prospered thanks to the Second World War, and that the great capital of the armament industries decided that it was convenient for the interests to remain as a world police state, and the economy should remain permanently as a war economy. Is that so today?
Oh, yes. That decision was made by Harry Truman, who, unfortunately, Roosevelt was forced to pick as his vice president not long before he died, meaning that when he died, Truman became president. Truman knew nothing about really anything. He had a very great, eventually, Secretary of State in Dean Acheson, who was a brilliant international lawyer for the banks. But there was Harry Truman, and when the first meeting that he had with Stalin after Germany fell was in Potsdam. And he arrived there trying to talk Stalin into joining us in the conquest of Japan as allies, as we had been allies against Hitler. And while he was sitting there, Truman was given a message from Alamogordo in New Mexico that the atom bomb worked. He didn't need Stalin. And then he looked again at Stalin and he felt, this is a good replacement for Hitler. And communism is a good replace for Nazism. And that is how the Cold War was born.
You said that President Bush will end his period as one of the most unpopular and hated presidents in the history of the United States. And do you still have the same opinion?
Yes, the people are not stupid. The people are out of control. If they don't count properly the votes in our presidential elections, and they miscounted deliberately in 2000, they vote for president, in which Albert Gore actually won the popular vote. 2004, ditto. The election was stolen. If we don't guard our elections better, then they can probably keep themselves in office forever. This is something new under the sun. I mean, the founding fathers could never have anticipated electronic balloting machinery or computers or anything like that. So this is a new sort of crime to go with a new sort of criminal, which is the Bush family personifies.
But these wars have developed a great anti-Americanism in the Arab states, in the Islamic world. So how would it end in somehow?
Well, it's been my experience in life. If you go up to somebody and hit them on the head with a hammer, they'll get another hammer and hit you on the head. We should not be surprised that What is surprising is that with our Constitution, in which you cannot have a war without a declaration of war by the House of Representatives, and these monsters have actually been able to manipulate Congress and the Supreme Court so that it gives credence to, I'm wartime president. And we have enemies. We got to fight them over there, or we're going to have to fight them here. Who are they? He's never named them because he doesn't know who he's talking about. Are they Talibans? Are they this? Are they that? Iraq and Afghanistan were two countries that could never have done us the slightest harm, had no desire to do so, and he took advantage of a bunch of religious zealots who bombed the two towers and hit the Pentagon, and he said, "I'm a wartime president, and I have powers such as you have never seen." Then he'd quote Abraham Lincoln. He never read him, but he was given the quote to say.
The American public would resist, you said so before, any war in Afghanistan and Iraq without a truly massive and widely perceived external threat. That was 9/11, of course. Was it induced or tolerated, as were the main sinking in Havana Bay, the battleship that sank here, Pearl Harbor, as you said before, or the Gulf of Tonkin incident? Do you think 9/11 could have been one of these fabricated incidents?
Oh, well, Tonkin Bay Gulf didn't exist. I mean, that was invented. But the bombing of New York City and Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania was real. And I accept the Osama bin Laden story. He thought that we were infidels and that we had occupied holy Saudi Arabia, and particularly Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities of the Muslims. And he thought our presence there was sacrilege. Well, religious zealots think like that. He made it very clear why he did what he did. But Bush wanted Iraq because his father hadn't finished the job. He's so stupid to know that the only thing his father did that was ever intelligent was not to go to Baghdad. Because how do you win a war with a city like that when you have nobody in your army who can speak Arabic, much less knows how to fight in the desert or fight in the alleys of Baghdad? So Bush Sr. wisely didn't go in there, and Junior was so stupid that he thought, well, if he went in there, he'd be bigger than his father. Well, I mean, all this is for, a bank of psychiatrists to deal with. I just hope they take him away and, in white.
What is your view about the Hamilton-Baker Commission conclusions, the withdrawal of troops from Iraq? What effect will it have inside the United States?
Well, our media is so corrupt. I mean, there's no way of getting information to the people. Yes, they'll talk about it on television, but they don't really tell the people what's in it. So the people don't know, and the propagandists from the regime will be busy on television telling lies about it. So we don't get any clear information about anything. You have to read and read and read to find out what's really going on.
But do you think at the present moment the rejection of the Iraq war is as much as the Vietnam War used to have in its moment?
Vietnam, we had the draft still, conscription. And Dr. Spock and I started a third party called the People's Party after my grandfather's invention back in the late 19th century, the original People's Party, the Populists as they were called. And Spock and I got a fair amount of support from young people. They didn't want to be sent to Vietnam. But then we found out they were totally apolitical. They had no interest in politics at all. So when finally the Vietnam War stopped, we stopped the Populist Party, the People's Party. And that was probably the beginning of the end, you know.
Let's talk a little about more personal matters, if you don't mind. You, as you said before, you are a stepson of Mr. Auchincloss, who was also the stepfather of Jacqueline Bouvier, later Kennedy Onassis. When she married she married Jack Kennedy, who later became President Kennedy. That gave you access to the White House, if I am correct. And so I would like to know your assessment of the Camelot years, of the Kennedy presidency, your memoirs of your stepsister, if you wouldn't mind speaking about that.
Well, personally, I thought Jack Kennedy was one of the most charming people I'd ever met. And I basically only knew him through Jackie. But we got to know each other quite well before he was president and 2 or 3 years into the regime. But his judgment was not all that good. And particularly the Bay of Pigs, which I believe is well known here, was a fatal error, which he blamed on the CIA with bad information. But he came to an overall assessment, but he was very intelligent. And he swore to himself, he said, never again to believe the military. But so he didn't take military advice very seriously until he got, later on, Maxwell Taylor, who was a rather scholarly general, who had been a student of my father's at West Point. And Taylor was a very beguiling figure and very intelligent. And Jack liked his advice, and suddenly there we are involved in Vietnam. And as you know of that, President Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs, he said, our problem with the Viet Cong is that under the Geneva Accords of 1954, I think it was, the agreement was that there would be a national election of North and South. But we discovered that if there were such an election, the communist Ho Chi Minh would win, and of course we could not allow that. So we didn't allow it, and we involved ourselves in a civil war in which we were handed our head at the end of it. We lost.
But do you sustain the Dallas conspiracy theory about his crime?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you think there was a conspiracy?
There were two.
Two conspiracies.
One was the Kennedy, Jack and Bobby were conspiring to remove Castro. Violence. Simultaneously, Bobby had been arresting mafiosi, particularly Marcello, who was the head of the mob in New Orleans, and before that he had great control over the Havana casinos. And Marcello decided it was time to get rid of Bobby Kennedy. And there was a conversation the FBI recorded between Marcello and the boss of Tampa, Florida, who said, we've got to get rid of Bobby. And Marcello says, when a dog bothers you, you don't cut off the tail, which was kill the president. And so there were two plots afoot. About everybody's worst nightmare was coming true at this time, and finally did come true at Dallas.
But the Cubans in Miami were also involved in that plot.
Oh, they were buzzing
and
around.
Perhaps the CIA too.
Oh, they were always buzzing around.
Yeah.
Somewhere. Then there were others who were involved in the anti-Castro plot. But it was so funny, these two things were going on side by side, and no one really suspected. Bobby Kennedy remained in Johnson's cabinet as Attorney General, which meant he was in charge of the FBI from then on. And all the friends of the Kennedys said, why don't you do something? Everybody knew there had been a conspiracy to kill Jack. And there were a lot of leads on where it was coming from. And Bobby was sitting around weeping all the time because he knew that if it was exposed, what the Kennedy brothers were up to vis-a-vis Cuba, this would be a cause for war with the Soviet Union.
Your second book, The City and the Pillar, deals with the forbidden subject of homosexuality in a very difficult time for an open talk on this matter. It was a risk and a defiance in that moment. Nowadays it's easier to speak about it. Why did you do it then?
Correction.
Right.
I was correcting views which were idiotic and prevalent. And I thought after, 3 years of the Army, and I knew pretty much how the world operated. And I thought it was time, really, that this one taboo should be broken. And it was too absurd to label people as part of a group on the grounds of sexuality. Suppose it was diet. Suppose, I like rice, you like potatoes. I mean, are we to go around, oh yeah, it's a potato person. I don't really like the potato people, I don't trust them. Or rice, is much, much better for you. Convert to rice. No, as an essayist, which I do most of the time, I like to think of it as, oh, you're so prescient and you guessed about Bush and so on. And I said, well, I'm not a prophet, certainly, but I said, I am a master of the obvious. If there's a hole in the street, I'll say there's a hole in the street. And if you don't fill the hole in the street, you will break the axle of your car. So, for this sort of illumination, I have been often cursed, but then I've often been blessed.
You said that the old republic died in 1950 with the Cold War and started the global empire. But what values do you think are still alive in the United States nowadays that need to be defended?
Well, there's still thousands of people who believe in our Constitution, in our civil liberties, in the powers of the courts. Some of the courts are actually honest and can be appealed to. We don't trust the Supreme Court after the year 2000 decision, but there are other courts. The rule of law is very important to us, and I think that's beginning to be restored. In the last 8 or 9 months, I've been all over the United States speaking. That's how I've lost my voice. Up and down California, raising money for the Democratic Party, even down into the heart of Texas, just to raise a little hell. And I found the crowds are big if you talk about serious reform. I mean, even in Texas, they refer to Bush as the carpetbagger president. They know he was just passing through on the train and claimed to be a Texan because his father had some oil interests there. They have nothing to do with Texas. But he had himself made governor, and then by accident he was made president. Jeb was the one who was supposed to be president, his brother, who apparently has a normal IQ.
You have behaved, as the New York Review of Books once said, as a frightened boy who has heard the wolf's howl in the middle of the forest. Are you still hearing that potential threat?
I am neither a boy nor frightened by a wolf cry. A wolf cry does get my attention, particularly if it's a bunch of Texas oil men baying like wolves over a new discovery of oil, or trying a new kind of weapon to obliterate a country for no reason except vanity, and because they can do it. They've actually, neocons, along with everything else, run off at the mouth a great deal. Oh, we're just trying to show, said Wolfowitz, that we could do it in Iraq. Well, who the hell is we? He doesn't speak for the American people. We were never consulted. So they're in worse trouble every single day. So the frightened boy might very well be Mr. Wolfowitz, now head of the World Bank, a place where he can do enormous damage. But that has been the gift of President Bush Jr., to always find the wrong person and put him in the wrong job. And his genius for that is beyond anything.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal, for your words. Thanks for your presence in Cuba.